Hey, team, welcome. There you go. Welcome to our week 11 lecture on the ecological crisis. We're now in the second last week of semester, which is very, very exciting. I hope you have enjoyed the course so far. We're now in the middle of our third part of our course, looking at the current challenges for international political economy and what's next for the future. So let's dive straight into things. These are our learning objectives for not only today, but also our tutorials next week as well. And these are our required readings. Now, obviously, we've only got 2 weeks to go till the end of semester. If you have not yet completed a leading of a book club and you don't have your name down for any of the remaining required readings for the next couple of weeks, please contact your tutors to sort something out. To hopefully squeeze you in some kind of leading capacity. Obviously, the leading the book clubs is important for your participation marks, but also, really vital for class engagement too. So this lecture, I'm hoping to kind of go through a little bit of the history of the current climate crisis, go through some key conceptual and theoretical issues around understanding the climate crisis, and then touching more on the current plans and reforms that have been in place to try to deal with this crisis. So we're starting a little bit further back in history before we then get to the present. So Earth's climate has obviously changed throughout its history, but the current warnings, which we'll go through in some detail soon, that we've seen and see every day, is we haven't kind of seen at such a rate in the past 10,000 years. Since systematic scientific assessment began in the 1970s, the influence on human activity on the warming of the climate or warming of the climate system has evolved from some kind of abstract theory to an established fact. And early in the 20th century, the prevailing notion was that people could alter climates locally by cutting down like forests and plowing fields, but not globally. And of course, the ice ages and other climate shifts of the past were then topics for research, but few considered them an immediate threat, and hardly anyone thought that humans could trigger worldwide climate change. There were a few pioneering thinkers, such as Swedish chemist Svante Arrhenius in the 1890s, had already seen the potential global impact of fossil fuel use, but their views were typically dismissed by colleagues at the time. And this Swedish chemist, Savant, argued that if quantities of carbonic acid or CO2 in the atmosphere would drop by half the current amount, then the Earth's surface temperature would drop by 4 degrees. And conversely, if they were to double, then it would warm by 4 degrees. And he went on to suggest that human-caused emissions of CO2 from burning fossil fuels would raise global temperatures. Then starting in the mid-1950s, around 1958, precise measurements of carbon dioxide confirmed a steady increase in the atmosphere. The first computer models of global climate in the 1960s and more complex ones after this point supported that the addition of greenhouse gases would indeed warm the climate. And then finally, the global temperature itself began to rise sharply in the 1970s and 80s, which helped raise the issue's profile among the media and the public as well as scientists. Then the food problems that were then emerging in the mid-1970s in a world that had surpassed over 4 billion inhabitants were also a reason why a number of scientists supported answering questions that were important to society more broadly. And at that time, the relationship between climate change and droughts was the most important of these. The Sahel and the Horn of Africa had suffered famines of climactic origin in the 1960s and 1970s, with more than 500,000 deaths and an undetermined number of migratory displacements. But it wasn't until 1984 to 85 that news of the disasters due to the lack of water reached public opinion. And in those years, a persistent drought ravaged the Sahel, triggering a major famine that made headlines in the press and on television. But the emission of greenhouse gases was still an obscure topic for governments and most certainly for citizens. But petrochemical companies, in the aftermath of the 1973 oil crisis, and where they were facing a future in which nuclear energy was kind of presented as the inevitable alternative to hydrocarbons, began to wonder if climate evolution could end up altering their business models. And especially when some economists and geologists had forecast that oil and natural gas reserves would deplete at the beginning of the 21st century. And proof of this was the largest oil company in the world, Exxon, launched a research project on carbon dioxide emissions in the summer of 1977. And interestingly, there's evidence that Exxon and other petroleum companies at this time knew of the damaging impacts of climate change and their contribution to it, but have engaged in decades of misinformation and blocking of progress on the issue. For example, in June 1988, when NASA told a congressional hearing that the planet was already warming, Exxon remained publicly convinced that the science was still controversial. Then by 1989, the company had helped create the Global Climate Coalition, which was disbanded by the early 2000s, to question the scientific basis for concern about climate change. And it also helped to prevent the US from signing the international treaty on climate known as the Kyoto Protocol, which we'll talk about in a bit more soon, in 1998 to control greenhouse gases. And Exxon's tactic not only worked in the US, but also stopped other countries such as China and India from signing the treaty. And between 2000 and 2015, Exxon had spent more than $30 million on think tanks that promote climate denial. Now, rather than denying anthropogenic climate change, scientists of the time believed that nature would absorb everything and had almost blind faith in technology, which would eventually solve the increasingly evident problems of pollution. And a lot of that still remains at the moment, where there's this idea some kind of technology will come along to save us. But in the 1980s, the first alarming forecasts appeared. In the future, there were not going to be enough resource to maintain the gigantic productive machine of the world economy, and the accelerated increase in water pollution and waste became an international concern. Then around 1987, a clear turning point occurred. The concept of sustainable development was born, which was promoted by a UN report as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the needs of future generations. The international reaction was led by the UN, which sowed the seeds of the future Millennium Development Goals, which then turned into the Sustainable Development Goals by 2015. Then 2 years later, in the late 80s, in 1989, the year of my birth, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was established under the UN to provide a scientific view of climate change and its political and economic impacts. So diplomacy has really provided a lot of movements on the response to climate change. And it's provided, for instance, the United Nations Framework Convention, the UNFCCC, and the Kyoto Protocol on Climate Change. And Kyoto was quite important. It was negotiated in 1997, but wasn't enforced until 2005. And it was originally for reducing the emission of 6 greenhouse gases in 41 countries, plus the European Union, to 5.2% below 1990 levels during the target period of 2008 to 2012. But importantly, after taking office, President Bush announced the United States would not implement the protocol, and saying that the protocol was fatally flawed in fundamental ways, and citing concerns that the deal would hurt the US economy. And yet, global emissions still soared by 40% to 2009, even though, when the Kyoto Protocol was in place. The successor to the Kyoto Protocol was supposed to be finalized at COP15 in Copenhagen, but the parties only came up with a non-binding document that is just taken note of and not adopted. This Copenhagen Accord acknowledged the global temperature should not increase by 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, though representatives from developing countries sought a target of 1.5 degrees. Then negotiators in Doha for COP18 extended the protocol, the Kyoto Protocol, until 2020, but remaining participants account for just 15% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. Now, one of the interesting things about the Kyoto Protocol, I'll just touch on before we move on, is that Article 3, subsection 7 of the Kyoto Protocol allows parties for whom, in 1990, land use changes constituted a net source of greenhouse emissions to include any such emissions in the calculation of their 1990 baseline, which then the treaty would be based on. Now, Australia was the only country, well, the only developed country in which vegetation clearing with its consequent emissions occurs to any substantial extent. And so this article applied basically exclusively to Australia. And it allowed the Australian government at the time, led by John Howard, to claim a 5-ton per year increment in greenhouse emissions, bringing Australia's 1990 emissions baseline to 26 tons per year, which is the highest per capita greenhouse emission level in the world. And given that the Australian government negotiated at the Kyoto conference a limit 8% above its already artificially high baseline, the Australian clause undermined the substantial environmental progress made by other parties, and also dramatically weakened Australia's environmental credibility and so negotiation clout in the international environmental arena. And in doing so, the government based its claims to special treatment on the particular vulnerability of its economy to measures that jeopardize the international competitiveness of its fossil fuel-based industries. Now, the 2015 Paris Agreement gave us hope that international society may yet reverse these trends and prevent dangerous climate change, but provided no firm and enforceable plans to actually do that. In this agreement, 197 countries pledged to set targets for their own greenhouse gas cuts and to report their progress, and it entered into force on the 4th of November 2016. And the backbone of this agreement was a declaration to prevent a global temperature rise of about 2 degrees. And many experts thought this was an extremely critical limit, which if surpassed would lead to increasing risk of more deadly heat waves, droughts, storms, and rising global sea levels. And the Paris Agreement works in this kind of like 5-year cycle of increasingly ambitious climate action, or should be, which is carried out by countries. Since 2020, countries have been submitting their national climate action plans, known as nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, where they kind of communicate the actions they'll take to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions to reach the goals of the Paris Agreement. Each successive plan is supposed to reflect an increasingly higher degree of ambition. And the first of the reports on the feedback of these plans, however, warned that governments in the world were not on track to meet the long-term goals of the Paris Agreement at all. And they said that the continued policies of the Paris signatories would result in a 2.7-degree increase by 2100. So the agreement provides a framework for financial, technical, and capacity building support to those countries who need it as well. It reaffirms that developed countries should take the lead in providing financial assistance to countries that are less endowed and more vulnerable, while for the first time encouraging voluntary contributions by other parties, and also speaks about some kind of technology development and transfer to improve resilience to climate change and reduce emissions. The Paris Treaty, though, has been undermined in many ways, not just because of the poor targets, but also by political leaders pulling out of the agreement. Most prominently, Donald Trump in 2016 pulled the United States away from the agreement before then President Biden reinstated them a little bit later then. Now, more recently, COP28 was the 28th session of the Conference of Parties that was held at the end of 2023, so the most recent ones here. This is, in other words, it's the United Nations Climate Change Conference, which had been running since 1995 to try to find some kind of solutions to climate change. And it functions as the decision-making body of the UNFCCC, and it's made up of all 199 signatories to the UNFCCC. And at each COP event, signatories are able to review and assess the measures they've introduced and discuss global solutions to the climate crisis. And like I mentioned before, the Paris Agreement was probably still the most notable outcome of any of these meetings in 2015. Now, the most recent one, COP28, began with a lot of controversy because the appointment of Sultan Ahmed Al Jaber as president delegate of COP28 was seen as a deeply controversial decision. Not only is Al Jaber the UAE Minister for Industry and Advanced Technology, he's perhaps better known as the chief executive of the UAE's national oil company, ADNOC, which is one of the world's largest oil and gas producers. And even more controversial is the fact that ADNOC is planning a huge expansion. And so it was kind of mired in controversy from the start. And the deal at the COP28 climate talks in Dubai stopped short of calling out nations to gradually phase out fossil fuels, probably quite unsurprisingly. And critics have argued that oil-rich countries have used their influence to water down the language on the need to eliminate fossil fuels here. And the discussions on fossil fuels actually turned into a marathon debate, a COP28, which extended the conference by a whole day. And even so, the resulting document was really totally inadequate. And also, there's the absences of the US president, the Chinese president as well. So there's a lot of future concerns about the international community's commitment to doing something constructive about climate change. And this is also true because the next COP summit is to be held in yet another fossil fuel powerhouse, Azerbaijan. So these are the kind of moves that we've seen anyway at the international level. That's some good coffee. All right. So we're going to talk now a little bit more about, well, why is this important for IPE, and talk about some of the key concepts and try to understand, like think about, well, how can we actually understand this climate crisis? And like I mentioned, carbon dioxide concentrations, the atmosphere has experienced exceeded, well, any kind of those experienced in the last million years. And the global greenhouse emissions trends show the planet hurtling towards a world potentially in this century that is 3 to 5 degrees warmer than the pre-industrial era, which might be a world of melted ice caps and permafrost, flooded cities, oceans so acidic they can't support life, and the loss of Amazonian rainforests. Ocean acidification, pollution, and overfishing may also cause the collapse of all major marine fisheries by mid-centuries. And indeed, even by now, 617 species of vertebrates have become extinct in the wild since the 1500s, which has exceeded the so-called background rate of extinction by over 100. And half the Earth's wild animals have disappeared in the last 4 decades. And all this is looming as much of the world suffers from a burden of extreme poverty and inequality, and communities from the Niger Delta to Bangladesh are condemned to live in sacrifice zones, devastated by oil drilling, mining, fracking, pollution, nuclear testing, and inundation. So with all of these gigantic challenges, climate change has moved from the margins to the center of international politics and international political economy as a field. From being one among many issues or fields aside, poverty reduction, health, trade, and all these other issues, it's now become somewhat of a master frame that will shape foreign policy and relations between states on a par with security and economic interests. There's still a lot of uncertainty about future climate responses, but scholars of world politics, such as us and scholars of international political economy, need to better reflect on climate change within existing theoretical frameworks and also develop new ones. But interestingly, in terms of the literature, I saw a paper the other day where there's been a survey of 5 major international relations journals, and keep in mind, international political economy somewhat is usually seen as a subfield of international relations. And this survey indicated that climate change was really not on their radar, where between 2015 and 19, only 0.76% of the articles in these journals were about climate change or related topics. And so arguably, by ignoring climate change, international relations and international political economy scholars run the risk of not being able to understand and explain what will be the defining aspect of global affairs in the coming decades. And in the worst case, the indifference of the mainstream IR and IPE literature towards climate change could be interpreted as ignorance or even a form of implicit climate skepticism. And what have been assumed to be fixed points of references for international affairs will not necessarily be so with climate change in the future. Territories may disappear, vast swathes of other countries may become uninhabitable, which will totally change the logic of state security and the focus of the state, which many mainstream theories in IPE have. And so it's very valuable for us to look at this issue more closely. And to date, most analysts have only fitfully or partially incorporated the most up-to-date understanding of climate change into their analysis. And there's perhaps kind of 3 major ways that mainstream scholars tend to think about climate change. The first is this thing of called threat multiplier, which is most familiar to the US Defense Department and focuses on how climate change creates increased probability of civil wars, forced migrations, political violence, and infrastructure damage. The second, which is issue trade-offs, or that's what it's called, imagines climate change as an issue area and one that creates instrumental trade-offs with other military and economic priorities, such as when the Obama administration in 2014 reportedly delayed a freedom of navigation operation in the South China Sea in exchange for Chinese support for the Paris Agreement. The third, altered landscapes, sees climate change not as an issue area at all, but as a pervasive background condition that is intrinsically connected to most other areas of interstate competition and cooperation. Now, we will touch on some of these mainstream views of global warming, but again, be predominantly concerned with the critical analysis of this vital issue. But there's some concepts that we need to start defining and unpacking first. Now, during this lecture and even during our tutorials, we might use terms climate change and global warming interchangeably. But there's been quite a lot of controversy actually to their use, where climate change generally refers to some kind of large-scale long-term shift in the planet's weather patterns and average temperatures, and it's arguably the result of global warming, where global warming refers to how much the Earth's surface temperature is rising, and it is the effect of this warming on average weather conditions that is known as climate change. And so climate change alters these, different established patterns of weather and leads to different consequences like more frequent droughts, heat waves, devastating hurricanes, and more intense rainfalls, to name just a few potential consequences. And climate change can also alter the timing of seasons, disrupt the lives of plants and animals. So global warming is often seen as a subgenre or sub-branch of climate change and a more short-term description of what is happening in our climate, with climate change being a more long-term description. But there's some critical voices that argue that climate change is deployed as a descriptive term because it sounds more ambiguous as to what that change might be. So it could be change for the good. Whereas global warming is a lot clearer as to say, what pattern is occurring, though, I still will be using these relatively interchangeably here. Now, another term you may have heard too is that of the Anthropocene, and this has become maybe the most common, slightly critical term that climate crisis has crept into the mainstream. And I'm not sure, but you may have seen a pop-up of my RMIT account problem. So we'll hope I'll check the recordings, but if that's come up, I'm sorry, but there's nothing potentially insecure about that message. But this Anthropocene term is an important one, and it represents an unprecedented change in the continued livability of planet Earth caused by the rapacious kind of use of natural resources with no thought for current and future generations of humans, and of the millions of other species affected by changing climatic conditions and ecosystem damage. It was formulated by scholars Paul Crutzen and Eugene Sturmer in 2000. And this Anthropocene concept proceeds from quite a reasonable position, which is the biosphere and geological time has been fundamentally transformed by human activity. And it's a new conceptualization of geological time that includes mankind as a major geological force that actually changes the world. And it was quite a courageous proposal at the time. And to propose humanity as a geological agent was to kind of transgress one of modernity's fundamental intellectual boundaries. And at its best, the Anthropocene concept entwines human history and natural history, even if it's not quite clear as to actually why this has happened and how. But from the outset, it's clear to be good about the Anthropocene's two lives, as we might call them, where one is Anthropocene as a broader conversation that transcends just like the university setting. And in this life, the Anthropocene has opened some measure of public space for dialogue around humanity's place in the web of life, which is really important. And it engages the really big questions of historical change. How do humans make natures? How do natures make humans? And how does that relation shape the long run of human history? But these are questions that the Anthropocene can pose, but cannot actually answer. And why this is because this perspective retains, even as it seeks to transcend, the dualist binary of humanity and nature that separates them. The dominant Anthropocene argument assumes quite a standard narrative, where it says that the origins of the modern world are to be found in England right around the dawn of the 19th century. The motive force behind this epochal shift is coal and steam. And the driving force behind this coal and steam, it's not capital, it's not imperialism, it's not class, it's not culture, but just humanity as an undifferentiated whole. So this Anthropocene makes for an easy story, and it's easy because it doesn't really challenge the naturalized inequalities, alienation, and violence, which is inscribed in modernity's strategic relations of power and production. And it's an easy story to tell because it doesn't ask us to think about these relations at all. It reduces the mosaic of human activity in the complete web of life around the world to quite an abstract, homogeneous, and singular humanity. It removes, inequality, commodification, imperialism, patriarchy, and much more from the problems of humanity within nature. And if sometimes acknowledged, at best, these kind of relations exist in the Anthropocene discourse as after the fact supplements. And we'll keep returning to this dualism of humanity and nature, but I want you to keep in mind the critiques that we leveled at this tendency of liberal thought for categorization in this manner that we made in the first few weeks of the course, and that it kind of arbitrarily separates intertwined processes, sections them off for understanding, and ignores how relations between processes, objects, and actors transcend and heavily influence and determine these arbitrary abstract boundaries. So we're going to look more at the Anthropocene concept. Now, the Anthropocene argument takes biogeological questions and facts as an adequate basis for historical periodization. So two subtle but powerful methodological decisions underpin the Anthropocene approach. Now, in the first instance, the empirical focus is narrowed by the consequences of human activity. So in this, the Anthropocene makes the case for humanity's domination of the Earth almost entirely through a significant catalogue of biospheric changes. The drivers of such changes are typically reduced to very broad, like black box descriptive categories, such as industrialization, urbanization, population, and categories like that. The second methodological choice turns on the construction of humanity as a collective actor, which I've touched on already. And this choice erases the historical geographical patterns of differentiation and coherence in the interests of just a narrative simplicity. This erasure and the elevation of the anthropos or humans as just a collective actor has encouraged several important misrecognitions. Firstly, a neo-Malthusian view of population. And if you remember from our early weeks, we may have briefly touched on Malthus as an important early political economist. And Malthus' view of population was that population determined then, the economy. And a lot of neo-Malthusian views of population are explicitly triggered towards population reduction, which ignore the modern world system's actually existing patterns of family formation and population movement and the use of resources. The anthropos as a collective concept also tends to create another misrecognition where a view of historical change is dominated by just technology resource complexes, such as, we've got a coal period, a steam engine period, a nuclear period, and so on and so forth. A concept of scarcity is also abstracted from relations of capital, class, and empire. And there's some kind of like assigning responsibility for global change to humanity as a whole, rather than the forces of capital and empire that have given modern world history its coherence. So the dominant Anthropocene argument therefore poses a question that it can't answer. How have humans become a geological force? And in answer to these gaps, another concept has been proposed to challenge the Anthropocene, and that is the Capitalocene. Now, the Capitalocene does not stand for just capitalism as an economic and social system, as it tries to integrate the idea of capital into explanations around the climate crisis. Instead, the Capitalocene idea signifies capitalism as a way of organizing nature, as a multi-species situated capitalist world ecology. So it's about the totality, and it seeks to capture the basic historical pattern of world history as the age of capital and the era of capitalism as a world ecology of power, capital, and nature. For the Capitalocene and the theorists who use this concept, the age of capital is not an argument about replacing, one word like human with another, capital. The Capitalocene argument says three important things that the Anthropocene perspective does not and cannot really. First, it insists that the history of capitalism is a relation of capital, power, and nature as an organic whole, and it's world ecological. It's a multi-species affair. Capitalism is neither a purely economic nor social system, but a historically situated complex of metabolisms, processes, and assemblages. And second, the history of capitalism cannot be reduced to just the burning of fossil fuels, whether it's in England or anywhere else. It is a history of the relations of power, and reproduction or production is premised on those relations of power, and also how the exchange of money fuels different relations as well. And this relation of processes and people and other relations to money is sometimes shorthanded as the cash nexus by critical scholars. These kind of, those relations enfolded coal and other energy sources from the 16th century. They allowed for successive waves of global conquest and the worldwide appropriation of cheap nature. And third, the Capitalocene argument challenges the Eurocentric view of capitalism as emerging in England during the 18th century, which we'll come back to and touch on in more detail. So most people and most scholars still think about capitalism as a matter of just economics. There's markets, prices, money, and all of that, and that's capitalism. But it's certainly not the most exciting thing to think about. But instead of thinking of capitalism just economics, we can think of capitalism as something more profound here with this view of the Capitalocene, which is to consider the rise of capitalism as a new way of organizing nature and a new way of organizing the relations between work, reproduction, and the conditions of life. Markets, prices, and money are still very important, with this framework of the Capitalocene, but it starts to allow us to look at how every market, every price movement and accumulation of money was bundled with nature itself, this extra human nature, and also human work too, much of it all unpaid and collected for free. So instead of capitalism as a world economy, we can look at capitalism as world ecology, as suggested by a very famous scholar in this area, Jason Moore. And from this particular perspective, there's three entwined historical processes that were fundamental in the rise of capitalism as world ecology, which helps try to explain the historical development of this period of the Capitalocene, which is contributing to these climate crises. The first one was what Marx called primitive accumulation. And this entailed a range of processes that made humans dependent on money, basically, for their survival. Social scientists call this proletarianization, and it assumed a really wide range of forms. And it wasn't always totally complete. It was very variegated, as we say. It happens at different times in different locations to different depths. But it's about generally the transformation of human activity into labor power, something to be exchanged in the commodity system, which is then sometimes called the labor market. And remember, we spoke about the idea of the value of labor in our first week. So even if one thinks that human activity is somehow independent of nature, there's no avoiding one fact that proletarianization, or the change of humans into proletariats or workers, was rooted in the governance of nature and the replacement of custom and common by the dominance of the commodity, by everything being bought and sold. So sometimes peasants who were forced off the land found their way into towns. Sometimes they were dispossessed and kept on the land, but they were reduced to cottages and forced into agricultural wage work or neo-serfdom to acquire what their small plots could not provide. And sometimes proletarians didn't look very proletarian at all, such as African slaves in Brazilian and Caribbean sugar plantations were a good example. And like wage workers in 17th century England or Peru, slaves also depended on money to survive, though they didn't directly earn it. And this proletarianization was never principally just economic. It was a product of new forms of territorial power that emerged after about the mid-1400s. And then this kind of contributes to our second process here that the Capitalocene looks at in the historical perspective, which is the old territorial power, which is at that time the overlapping jurisdictions and personalized authority of medieval Europe had crumbled in the long feudal crisis between like the early 1300s and the mid-1400s. West Central Europe's ruling classes had tried to restore feudal labor systems and failed. The most dynamic of the new states then owed their dynamism to an alliance with merchant capitalists who were far more than just merchants. And at this particular time, it was the alliance of the Iberian crowns with, in Spain with the Genoese capitalists from Italy that quite literally made the space that made capitalism possible. Which allowed capitalism to be also transatlantic. And so the new empires that were financed by Genoese capital launch from the Iberian Peninsula were made possible by a different power of a new type. And at its core was the generalization of private property. For a new praxis of modern private property emerged in these centuries. Its strategic goal was the separation of the peasantry and the poor people from non-market access to land, arable and grazing lands, forests, wetlands, and everything else. This was the fundamental condition of changing humans into workers. And like this process called proletarianization, these dispossessions were enormously varied, and it helped increase the capital of the newly formed states to actually go on to establish empire. And then our third great historical process turned on new ways of knowing the world. These were purely symbolic, but they were also far more than that. The ongoing condition of turning human activity into labor power and land into property was a symbolic knowledge regime premised on separation, on alienation. And we can think of this new knowledge regime, and this is around the Enlightenment, as a kind of series of scientific revolutions in the broadest sense of the term. This regime made it possible to launch and sustain a process that really threatens us all still today, which puts the whole work of nature to work for capital. The job of science was, and arguably still is to make nature legible to capital accumulation, transforming it into units of nature and counterpoise to the forces of capital and empire. The job of the economy was to channel this alienation through being able to be bought and sold for money. And the job of the state was to ensure that process. So the separation of nature, that a concept like humanity and nature, as by stating them, it indicates a separation from between the two, was always illusory. Humans can never escape nature. But the terms of the relationship did change. It started to become a whole entire world-changing process of remaking the globe in the image of capital. And there was the new thought structures that accompanied this, and the new scientific ways of understanding the world carried a mode of distinction that presumed separation. So we had separations of humanity and nature. So then some people became humans who were members of something called civilization or society, as Adam Smith detailed in his concept of civilized society in the mid-1700s. But from the beginning of capitalism, most humans were actually excluded from this idea of humanity. So Indigenous Australians, for example, Indigenous Americans, they were only designated as maybe partly human, as were virtually all European women. And as with property, the symbolic boundaries between who was and who was not part of nature or society tended to shift and vary. They were often very blurry, and they were very flexible. But there was always a boundary there, and much of the history of modern race and gender turns on the struggles over that particular line. Now that boundary, this idea of knowledge that divided nature and society, that the Anthropocene affirms as part of its theorization, was fundamental to the rise of capitalism, because it allowed nature to become nature, an external environment without humans. Nature was also, of course, full of humans that were treated as nature. But what does this actually mean? And it meant that the web of life could be reduced to a series of external objects that could be mapped, explored, surveyed, calculated for what nature could do for the accumulation of capital. And the substance of that value was human labor productivity, but not all humanly productive work. it was measured without regard for its cultural, biophysical, and cooperative dimensions. There's this idea of which we explored in the week one, where human work was abstracted, averaged, and deprived of all its meaning but for one, which is value as the average labor time to make the average commodity. In highlighting the Cartesian dualism between humans and nature as a key source of this problem, we're seeking to make sense of the three great thought procedures that have shaped the modern world, where there's an imposition, firstly, of an ontological status upon entities as opposed to relationships. So remember, we spoke about quite a bit in class about there's liberal thought sees things as things and has a privileging of objects as they are of themselves, rather than seeing relationships between things, whether that be between energy, matter, people, ideas, and whatever it might be. There's also a centrality of a logic of either or, so you can be either this or that, but there's no overlapping of categories of people, of things, or whatever it might be. And then third, the idea of some kind of control over nature through science, that humans could master nature through science. And at this time, between the 1500 and 1700s, and even after, most humans were in this category of nature rather than humanity, as I noted. And this was an audacious act of global bookkeeping in one sense, besides all the other physical horrors that it entailed. On one hand, the decisive thing was work was reproduced through the buying and selling of commodities. And this included a great deal more people in early modern capitalism than the scholars usually acknowledge. The work that was through the buying and selling of commodities also completely relied on the work that was outside of that buying and selling of commodities, which was the appropriation of very cheap nature, of very cheap free labor by either slaves or women or people who weren't counted in humanities. And so the appropriation of women, nature, and colonies was the fundamental condition of the exploitation of labor power in the commodity system. And this is the disproportionality at the heart of capitalism between paid work, which occurs through the exchange of commodities for money, and unpaid work, which is reproduced outside this circuit of capital, but it's totally indispensable to it. Every act of producing surplus value through making and buying commodities in this nice capital nexus depends disproportionately upon a much greater act of appropriating unpaid work of human and extra-human natures. And because capitalism is a system that's driven by competition in the so-called productive sphere, which implies a necessity to increase the productivity of labor, the greater volume of things produced per hour of necessary labor time, it then requires ever larger spheres of taking free nature and non-nature work. So again, the more that factories and commodity production expands, the greater the necessity for free labor from women, from others, and from nature itself. And the whole system works because capital pays for only one set of costs and works strenuously to keep all other costs off the books. And this is the audacious act of bookkeeping. There's costs of reproducing labor power, food and energy, but it tries to keep as much of the costs of the actual hidden work that's required as hidden as possible. And this goes back to the symbolic, material, and also bodily violence of the separation between humanity and nature, which performed a kind of work for the modern world. And it was backed by imperial power and capitalist rationality. It mobilized the unpaid work and energy of humans, and especially women, and especially the enslaved, in service to transforming landscapes with a singular purpose, which is the endless accumulation of capital. And even with the Anthropocene's historical perspective, as I've noted before, we can see a philosophical position which we can call Cartesian dualism. So Descartes theorized the separation of humans from the rest of nature, and it appeared as a self-evident reality. It locates humanity in one box and the rest of nature in another. But the differences between and within each acting unit are not mutually constitutive, such that change in one implies changes in the other. And this dualism leads Anthropocene advocates to construct the historical period since 1800 on an arrhythmic basis, almost, where you have like human activity plus significant biospheric change equals we have an Anthropocene. This perspective actually obscures the existing relations through which women and men made history in the entire totality of the web of life. So it's this Cartesian dualism between nature and humanity is a problem not merely because it's philosophically problematic, but because it's practically bound up with a way of thinking about the world, which is thinking about like what is in the world, the ontology and the epistemology of how do we know about it, that took shape between the 15th and 18th centuries, that tended to exclude huge numbers of so-called non-human people and also excluded the real work of nature to fuel the rise of capitalism. And this was also a part of new technologies as well that helped worked through this disproportionality and through this separation of humanity from nature. Technology was not only always employed to advance labor productivity, but to appropriate a rising physical mass of unpaid work or energy from different natures. And we see this at work in the long history of capitalist mechanization. 16th century sugar mills, 18th century steam engines, the Fordist assembly lines, all were premised at every turn on the appropriation of this other nature, which was cheap nature. The plantation system was built on cheap land and labor. Steam engines developed at the pit heads of coal mines. The Fordist assembly lines were worthless without cheap oil, steel, and coal. The bonanza of cheap fossil fuels allowed capital to smooth out its greatest problems before 1830, which was the recurrent underproduction of food, energy, and raw materials owing to advanced labor productivity in industrial centers. But since the 1970s, the possibilities for securing cheap nature have narrowed. And this progressive closure, which is the closure of capitalism's cheap nature frontiers, has set in motion a new tendency, arguably, which is widely discussed in terms of neoliberalism, which is the reassertion of market rule and sharply rising inequalities between rich and poor. This period of neoliberalism is often viewed as a triumph, and in terms of greatest expansion of globalization and connectivity between people that the globe has ever seen. But what we are now in fact seeing is the exhaustion of a centuries-long model of appropriating unpaid work and energy outside the exchange of the commodity or just buying and selling things through money. Capitalism's metabolism of work, energy, and labor is crucial because it sharpens our focus on how human work unfolds through the entirety of planetary life. And the genius of capitalism has always been to find ways through culture, science, and the state to appropriate streams of work and energy for free or at low cost. And we find that great economic revolutions that propel labor productivity within the commodity system are always accompanied by new imperialisms, new sciences and new forms of state power. And we'll actually be looking at the new form of state power within neoliberalism in our final week. So now all of this is to say, there's this distinction between the Anthropocene and Capitalocene arguments. And much of it is through taking the centrality of work as vital to our thinking about capitalism. We have a relational view of how work, power, and reproduction since the late 1400s has then shaped our world today. So from this particular angle of vision, which looks at the harboring of nature and non-human work, which is often also very much done by human beings, there's a very different view of the Anthropocene problem comes into focus. How the origins of new patterns of environment making began in the Atlantic world during the long 16th century. And the difference speaks to divergent historical interpretations and also differences in political strategy. To locate modernity's origins through the steam engine and the coal pit through like the Anthropocene theorization is to prioritize just shutting down the steam engines and the coal pits and the 21st century incarnations of that. But to locate the origins of the modern world with the rise of capitalism after the mid-1400s, with its audacious strategies of global conquest, endless commodification, and relentless rationalization, is to prioritize a much different politics, which is one that pursues the fundamental transformation of the relations of power, knowledge, and capital that have made the modern world. Shut down a coal plant and you can slow global warming for a day. But if you can shut down the relations that made the coal plant, then you can stop it for good. So then how does Capitalocene understand the problem of global warming, which is kind of the fundamental point I've been trying to get to here? And the rise of capitalism after the mid-1400s marked a turning point in the history of humanity's relations with the rest of nature. It was greater than any watershed since the rise of agriculture and the first cities. And in relational terms, it was even greater than the rise of the steam engine. The rise of capitalism after the mid-1400s marked a shift in the scale, speed, and scope of landscape transformation across the geographical expanse of early capitalism. The long 17th century forest clearances of like the Vistula Basin and Brazil's Atlantic rainforest occurred on a scale and at a speed between 5 and 10 times greater than anything seen in medieval Europe. Feudal Europe had taken centuries to deforest large expanses of Western and Central Europe, but after the mid-1400s, comparable deforestation occurred in decades, not centuries. To take but one of the many examples in medieval Picardy, which is kind of a northeastern France, it took 200 years to clear 12,000 hectares of forest, and beginning in the 12th century. Now, 4 centuries later, in northeastern Brazil, at the height of the sugar boom in the mid-1600s, 12,000 hectares of forest would be cleared in a single year. So these are kind of precious clues to a transition in the relations of power, wealth, and nature that occurred over the course of the long medieval crisis and the epochal shift that commenced after the mid-1400s. Now, in the centuries between the mid-1400s and mid-1700s, we find a new era of human relations with the rest of nature, the age of capital. Its epicenters were the seats of imperial power and centers of financial might. And it was throughout all the ecosystems around the world, including that of humans as well, from the Baltic to Brazil, Scandinavia to Southeast Asia. And this Capitalocene accelerated environmental transformation beyond anything known before. Sometimes, as with like forest clearances, moving at speeds an order of magnitude greater than the medieval pattern. These were, there were obviously certain technological shifts that facilitated this landscape revolution. But alongside new technologies, there were what we call new techniques, which is basically a repertoire of science, power, and machinery that aimed at discovering and appropriating cheap natures. And above all, there were new ways of mapping and calculating the world. And perhaps most fundamentally was a shift which was, not really that detectable to contemporaries at the time, but a shift in what was actually valued. All civilizations have laws of value, which are broadly pattern priorities for what's valuable and what is not. The decisive shift between the old medieval periods, which is kind of marked by the Black Death, and then the conquest of the Americas, was precisely this, that value shifted from land productivity under conditions of feudal power to labor productivity under the hegemony of the world market, and which was the very basis and living atmosphere of the capitalist mode of production. But what difference can this make to our understanding of biospheric crisis in the 21st century? And I'd argue here quite a big one. The shift from land to labor productivity as the decisive metric of wealth implied a totally novel approach to the relation between human activity and the web of life around the entire planet. For the first time, the forces of nature were deployed to advance the productivity of human work, but only some human work. The human work that was within that sphere of commodity production and exchange, which is sometimes misleadingly called the economy, was to be valued. All other activity was devalued and appropriated in service to advancing labor productivity in the economy. And so the birth of what was known as nature, so this idea of thinking that nature is something, out there, which implied and then necessitated the opposite birth of society, were both dripping with blood and dirt. And this is the metaphor that Marx uses. The necessarily ontological counterpoint to the separation of the producers from the means of production. So this is saying that as soon as there was the kicking off of peasants and the poor from the land that they had owned and lived on for hundreds of years before then, this then allowed the idea of this nature that was out there, outside of the cities, that could be harnessed to put into service for society, which was the new expanding capitalist market around the world. And the first accomplishment of this new law of value, which is a law of cheap nature, was therefore to create cheap labor. The number of slaves disembarked each decade in the Americas, mostly to grow sugar, which was modernity's original cash crop, increased a staggering 1,000% between the mid-1500s and the early 1700s. Slave prices still tended to rise, which was a tribute to capitalism's devastation of human nature, but from a base much lower than the wage bill for European workers. For cheap labor and productive labor required one thing if profitability was to advance, and the accumulation of capital was to quicken, which is cheap energy, cheap food, and raw materials. Cheap thermal energy was necessary to, smelt the metals, process sugarcane, and make glass, beer, bricks, and everything else demanded by the world market. Cheap food was vital to keep the price of labor power from rising, which was the whole point of Ricardo's economics. And then cheap raw materials, such as timber for shipbuilding, iron for everything, was to maintain a virtuous cycle or circle of expanding commodity production. In sum, the whole of nature had to be put into work in a radically alienating, dynamic way for capitalism to survive. And this entrained a landscape revolution that's unprecedented in human history. Its first condition was the conquest of the Atlantic. Between the mid-1500s and the late 1600s, the capitalist world economy more than doubled in size, conquering some 4 million square kilometers. And this appropriation of the New World was the fundamental structure of the first modernity. These conquests incorporated not only vast expanses of potentially cheap nature, but also the labor power to activate it. By 1500, Spain alone had colonized more than 2 million square kilometers, which was an area greater than the whole of Europe of the center, and more than 25 million indigenous peoples, many of who were forcibly integrated into a system of work that produces value for the Europe of the center. So these in figures were complemented by capital's new thirst for the cheap nature within Europe itself. In the Low Countries, an agricultural revolution allowed 3/4 of Holland's labor force to work outside of agriculture. And it was a revolution because, like the English agricultural revolution that then followed, it advanced labor productivity and expelled labor from the countryside. By the end of the 16th century, wheat yields peaked, reaching a level not exceeded until the late 19th century. And in Central Europe, a mining and metallurgic revolution supplied the emergent capitalist order with a physical basis for money and manufacturing with iron and copper. Forests were, and the way that forests were commons beforehand, were rapidly transformed. Central European mining and metallurgic reached its zenith in the half century from the mid 1400s to the early 1500s. And this region produced the lion's share of early capitalism's basic raw materials, such as copper, lead, and iron. And more significantly, these new mining techniques, which underpinned a really significant industrialization, allowed for a revolutionary increase in silver production. And this is also where the origins of cheap money as well. Production of all metals soared by 2 to 5 times between the mid 1400s and early 1500s. This new metallurgic capitalism scoured the countryside for fuel, affecting widespread pollution and deforestation. And the same continued in the newly conquered regions in the Americas as cheap silver was mined and cash crop commodities were grown for continental Europe. Now, by the 1700s, England had become Europe's breadbasket. Between 1700s and the mid 1700s, England's grain exports increased 500%, which was 6 times faster than aggregate exports. But then by mid-century, the English agriculture stagnated because the nitrogen reserves in the soil were totally depleted. Exports then collapsed. And then the problem at this particular time was how humans had mixed their labor with the earth. The problem of agricultural productivity in late 18th century England, which was then marked by runaway food price inflation and a net per capita reduction in food consumption because the soil was totally exhausted, was because the labor had totally exhausted the soil. And several global transformations then started to occur out the back of this English crisis in agriculture. There was a great burst of Iberian and Italian expansions, which produced also a relative exhaustion of Mediterranean forests. For these powers, deforestation weighed heavily on the capacity to supply quality shipbuilding timber, which was really fundamental to the commercial and military struggles of the time. And then they had to relocate their shipbuilding offshore. And the relentless geographical expansion of forest products and shipbuilding frontiers was bound up with a great hunt, where, like such as with whaling vessels that devour the North Atlantic sources of maritime protein, and the transcontinental search for furs in Siberia and North America. There was great frontier movements that continued across the Atlantic world, which reshaped food, energy, and labor relations. Steadily rising sugar demand by the mid-17th century then favored successive sugar revolutions in the West Indies. Sugar transformed Barbados, Jamaica, and St. Domingue into agro-export platforms over the next century, which left a trail of African graves and denuded landscapes in its wake. The resurgence of Mexican silver production in the 18th century also led to deforestation of an already thin Mexican forests. And perhaps most significantly, the epoch-making Columbian exchanges, as old world diseases, animals, and crops flowed into the Americas, and then new world crops such as the potatoes and maize flowed into the old world. So all these like small crises around the mid 1700s to the 1800s engendered totally changing landscape forms and totally different shifts of people and products across the globe as capitalism sought to mine and capture cheaper and cheaper nature. And the genius of capitalism that we can see in this period is to treat the work of nature as a free gift. From the beginning, Europe's empires set deploying science in a really wide sense to map the world, collect and organize biogeographical knowledge, establish new administrative technologies to make the whole of nature work on the cheap. These were conquests that made plunder work for capitalism in a way that went beyond brute force and domination. But it's hard to sustain a civilization just on plunder. And especially because plunder is too episodic, too violent, and over the long run, too costly. And the Spaniards discovered this quickly in the 16th century, where they plundered throughout the Americas, and they totally exhausted their mines, for example. And so they discovered that the great divide of nature and society could be very useful for rendering not only land, but labor cheap. The Spaniards referred to the Peruvian indigenous population as naturals. Not all humans were part of humanity, and then the better that they could deliver cheap nature if they weren't. And so that long history has been reproduced over the past 4 decades. The Earth is now ringed by over 2,000 satellites, which enable unprecedented surveillance and mapping of planetary space. The human genome was mapped. Biopiracy and biotechnology have proceeded, but today it is different from the 1970s for two big and closely related reasons. First, the potential sources of cheap nature are fewer than ever before. The non-revolution in agricultural biotechnology shows this well, because there was all these kind of claims that biotechnology will somehow feed the world, but there's been no revolution in agricultural productivity, and agricultural productivity growth has slowed steadily since the mid 1980s, and also the same with energy. After the opening of modest oil frontiers in the 1970s, such as in Alaska, the Gulf of Mexico, West Africa, and the North Sea, there's been no major sources of cheap energy that have appeared really so far. And the world energy history of the past decade has been marked by the opening of frontiers that are the very opposite of those which have sustained capitalism. These are not low-cost frontiers of production, but very high-cost frontiers, especially in North America's unconventional oil sector. And nor does cheap labor seem to be really here to stay. The rise of China as the workshop of the world in the 1990s and 2000s occurred in part because of its massive cheap labor flowing into the cities from the countryside. But this, like all cheap nature frontiers, was a one-shot deal. Even in China, wages are rising in the cities and quite rapidly, and the countryside no longer offers an easy reservoir of cheap labor power. So arguably today there's nowhere to run. Much of what we've seen global capitalism achieve over the past decade has been a shifting of costs from one capitalist to another, and especially from capital to the vast majority. And there has been another vector of cost shifting, which has been accelerating in recent years, from the present to the future. And this is true as widely recognized for future generations, but it's also come true for the accumulation of capital, which has always been a series of bets on future income. The real basis of that future income has always been there's going to be some kind of cheap nature we can rely on and extract. And so therefore, this has helped create financialization and the polarization of income and wealth, where the 1% and the 99% are the predictable results of the end of cheap nature. That end of cheap nature may not bring liberation, but can potentially sustain capitalism. And as the frontiers of cheap nature have gotten more and more smaller, where capital can't go out to the other parts of the world and exploit cheap resources, which are becoming less and less and less, it then has to create financialization and fake speculative fictional commodities that it can then trade but have no real value or no actual tangibility with them. And this financialization is also really important to help us understand the responses of capitalism to the climate crisis, which we'll now talk about then. So the whole point of this was just to say that the way of understanding climate change through the Anthropocene is one which has helped, I guess, situate humanity as a central actor in this change, which is important. But this also misses the central role that capital has in changing the relations of the planet, in changing the landscapes of the globe. And most of this is through how we understand the world. And the Anthropocene understands the world through categorization of a human and a nature, whereas the Capitalocene perspective argues that this Cartesian dualities actually hides how the so-called cheap nature has been totally integrated with society, with capital, and has driven forward the modernity project of humanity, and it can't be separated from it. And this goes back to our idea of ontological relations, where in the world, it's not just a separate humanity and a separate nature. These things are totally intertwined and connected. So now green finance is one of the most important ways that capital has responded to the climate crisis. And this happened, or arguably kind of accelerated, at the Copenhagen COP meeting 2009. And one of the major advances here was a commitment by rich countries to fund mitigation and adaptation actions in poor countries. And initially, there was a commitment to provide US $30 billion per year of climate financing, and then up to US $100 billion per year by 2020. By the Paris COP in 2015, there was also the establishment of the Green Climate Fund, which was a newly established financial mechanism to attract, distribute, and program climate finance. And market mechanisms for achieving greenhouse gas emission reductions have been at the core of the international climate architecture for decades. The Kyoto Protocol included several market tools for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, which were called flexibility mechanisms. And reflecting neoliberal common sense, there's also markets for carbon, which were claimed as the most efficient means of delivering emissions reductions. Market tools were also the most politically acceptable option for most proponents around the world, but particularly in North America. And so the center of gravity for carbon markets did shift to Europe in the years following the Kyoto Agreement in the late 90s. And these market mechanisms operate under the assumption that greenhouse gas emissions reductions are globally equivalent. And so these mechanisms facilitate flexibility and least cost by allowing countries to meet their emission targets through projects that reduce emissions in another cheaper country. Political economists and economic geographers of climate change have called the financial activity generated by the market mechanisms of the Kyoto Protocol and since as the new carbon economy. And one of the most popular types of financial activity generated here is that of green bonds, which is a really important and relatively new tool in green finance. As the most significant portion of the broader sustainable debt market, these green bonds promise to treat our ecological deficit with debt. And the first green bond was issued in 2007 by the European Investment Bank for 0.8 billion. And the Climate Bond Initiative, which is a non-for-profit group that produces a certification scheme for green bonds, calculates that the subsequent annual growth of green bonds to be around 95%, with a total issuance reaching more than $1.5 US trillion by the end of 2021. Now, a green bond operates in much the same way as a vanilla bond, as a mechanism for public or private actors to borrow money. And I actually think I have a little diagram. Oh, I do. So this basically is where a borrower issues a bond. So this is our borrower or issuer here, and sells it to an investor. So this coupon, for instance, they sell this to this investor over here, who then effectively loans money to the issuer in return for this regular interest payment. So 5% annual coupon in this example here, as well as full repayment of the loan at maturity. For both investors and investors, both issuers and investors, bonds are relatively secure and reliable, and even are known as boring in the financial sphere. They offer steady and secure returns for investors who own a liquid asset or money, and often cheaper capital or otherwise more favorable terms than bank loans for issuers, where interest rates might be higher than the bond payouts. And green bonds are structured in much the same way, except that their capital is intended for projects with environmental and climate credentials. And the majority of green bonds are use of proceed bonds, which basically use their proceeds for specifically green projects or collectives of projects. And almost half of the value of total green bonds issued is from Europe, with another quarter concentrated in North America. And China has become a major player, driving growth since 2015. And this rapid growth is closely linked to a booming debt financing market in China more broadly, which is in turn connected to big infrastructure portfolios in the country. And there's also been a shift in who is issuing green bonds. Originally, the market was driven by multilateral development banks, but over time, they've been principally become investors in green bonds issued by other actors. The green bond issuance market is now driven by financial and non-financial corporates, with sovereign state issuers growing over time. However, both in terms of financial and environmental benefit, the Global South remains locked out of the green bond market. And there's been quite a bit of research which has highlighted that patterns of socio-spatial inequality are repeated within projects that are funded by green bonds. There's been really few granular studies of the expansive impacts of projects funded by green bonds, but case studies have demonstrated that there is an unequal distribution of risk between investors, issuers, and the publics to which government issuers are ultimately responsible, and the environment. Because quite typically, I mean, not always, but typically it's really government who are usually the issuers of bonds, certainly for so-called vanilla bonds, but also much of the time for green bonds too. And there was one study that I saw this week where a couple of geographers studied the use of municipal green bonds to finance repairs to the New York City transit system following the big storm they had in 2012, and also to refinance water supply infrastructure in Cape Town in the midst of its severe drought a few years ago. And in both instances, the financial risks of responsibility for repayment of the green bonds to investors and the environmental risks of climate change and its disruption of essential urban goods and services were largely distributed along historically produced racialized and class lines. And these authors showed that financing through green bonds facilitated this kind of perverse reverse subsidy from the poor to the wealthy through increased taxes and user fees that governments who had issued the green bonds had to levy in order to repay the bonds back to global investors. Now, another response to climate change has been the creation of precision markets, which are markets and market-based policies that seek to allocate responses to climate change by charting pathways towards an efficient level of adaptation and mitigation. Precision markets are the kind of quintessential tools of climate finance envisioned by economists and actuaries. Precision markets are ways of making climate mitigation and adaptation economic. So it's, again, putting the idea of climate into economic terms, as we talked about through the historical process before. And this is broadly known as economization, which is the process of making all things and subjects economic. Through this kind of process of economization, both climate policy and climate policy decision-making becomes a calculative exercise with rational decisions and decision makers expected to trade off current and future risks, costs and benefits. And as a result, economization requires making market subjects, which one particular scholar has called Homo carbonomicus in response, or kind of citing Foucault's Homo economist. Or the carbon price calculating subject, whether it's government agencies using calculations of the social cost of carbon to make decisions, polluting companies deciding whether to reduce or offset their emissions, or individual households and farmers taking out insurance policies. Precision markets position new agents to account for climate risk. As climate governance in the post-Kyoto period has largely been left to the markets, new climate markets have then proliferated. And the making of markets for managing climate change is often studied through the framework of economization, or the performativity of economics. And we'll look at some examples here that of carbon trading and carbon offsetting. And really the most obvious example of a precision market is that of carbon trading, where there's some kind of carbon pricing attempts to translate nominal social costs of carbon into real economic costs for greenhouse gas emissions. This occurs either through taxation, where governments put a price on carbon emissions, or trading, where the polluters set the carbon price through buying and selling of emission permits. And carbon trading is really a precision market par excellence, because by commodifying carbon, it aims to make different emission reductions infinitely comparable and substitutable. In the idealized construction of carbon markets, it's the market itself, rather than state regulators, that precisely determines the efficient climate pathway. And carbon pricing is often viewed as the crucial piece of the climate finance puzzle by policy elites. The IMF describes carbon pricing as the single most powerful and efficient tool for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The appeal lies not only in economic theory, but also the potential for carbon markets to cohere a coalition of states, industry, and environmental organizations in favor of a regime of accumulation by decarbonization. But the carbon pricing project has been constantly unsettled by arguments and protests that the equivalents of carbon markets are a fantasy that represents a dangerous distraction of and for climate policy. And these kind of carbon trading or emission trading schemes are usually constructed where governments as regulators set a cap on emissions, which should, in theory, be consistent with the optimal level of climate change, as economists would term it. Then they distribute a quantity of permits equal to the total cap. So these permits kind of represent a right to pollute in these carbon markets because they're underpinned by compliance rules that require polluters to surrender a quantity of permits equal to their level of pollution over a given time period, which is usually a year. But these permits are tradable, which means that polluters with either deficits or surpluses of permits can buy or sell permits with other polluters, respectively. The economic logic here of emissions trading is that different companies, industries, and countries have different abatement costs. That means that some are able to reduce their pollution more cheaply than others. And then trading is said to allow polluters to find the least cost emissions reductions, achieving what is understood to be the same climate outcome with the least economic impact. Now, carbon offsetting, these are schemes that are sometimes called baseline and credit, which offer another market-based option for reducing emissions. Instead of governments creating permits equal to the overall cap on emissions, such as in carbon trading, under carbon offsetting, emissions reduction projects, such as those that promise to stop deforestation or install renewable energy, they're judged against a business as usual baseline. So if project emissions are below this baseline, they're awarded credits that can then be sold to governments, companies, or individuals to offset their emissions. The economic logic of carbon offsetting is that revenue from selling carbon credits incentivizes additional emissions reductions from projects compared to what would otherwise occur. These green projects may remove emissions, as in negative emissions technology projects, or avoid emissions, as in energy efficiency projects. Offsetting projects don't need to be zero carbon, just lower carbon than that they otherwise would be under this hypothesized baseline situation. Now, across this kind of variegated and differentiated carbon market landscape, both emission trading and carbon offsetting schemes have been troubled by over-allocation and over-crediting, leading to low and at times volatile prices for carbon. So, for instance, in 2021, the average carbon price in emission trading schemes was 3.5 euros, which is well below even conservative estimates of the social cost of carbon. Carbon offset prices both were even lower. And these vary according to the project type and registry. But in 2009, offsets from renewable energy projects range from between US 40 cents and $4.80, compared with basically US $2 to $10 for forestry offsets. And carbon markets operate through a series of abstractions that make greenhouse gases that are emitted or reduced by different companies in different sectors of the economy in different places and different points in time the same as tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. These abstractions and equivalences are necessary for markets to function to enable the precise trade-offs to find the optimal response to climate change. And again, it's about science and knowledge putting nature into a legible manner for capital. And from the perspective of conventional economics, the wider the scope of abstraction and equivalence, including by linking different schemes, the greater heterogeneity in abatement costs, which lead to more efficient outcomes through trading. But the question is always like, are these abstractions of carbon markets really equivalent? Critics of carbon trading and especially of carbon offsetting have argued that the approach facilitates a spatial displacement of action on climate change from north to the south, which results in carbon colonialism. And offsets have been likened to modern day versions of the indulgences sold by the medieval Catholic Church, where sinners could buy surplus good deeds from the clergy. And as a result, what is being sustained is not the climate, but arguably consumption. And these views of carbon markets ultimately hinge on competing visions of the climate transition as an incremental or transformative process. Economists are adamant that carbon pricing works. For example, in a major economic metric study of 142 countries, a few economists found that countries with carbon prices reduce fossil fuel combustion-based emissions by 2% per year more than those without carbon prices. These reductions were described as substantial. And a review of similar studies by a different economist also found that carbon pricing schemes delivered emissions of reductions of around 0 to 2% per year. But the same economist of that particular study described such impacts as quite limited, which produced incremental results rather than the 10% reductions per year needed to reach the 1.5 degree climate goal. Contrasting views about the same evidence are grounded in different visions of the climate transition. From the perspective of economists, incrementalism is a virtue, as carbon pricing is supposed to deliver least cost climate action at the margin. Yet, from a perspective that views climate change as a structural problem, transformational change beyond carbon pricing is required. For example, there's agreement that many of the European Union emission trading schemes emissions reductions come from just fuel switching from coal to gas. Whether this is an efficient response or one that entrenches fossil fuels more deeply and just different fossil fuels depends on your perspective about incrementalism or transformation. The risk of carbon markets, however, is that more transformational changes are traded for more incremental ones, driven by the least cost logic of carbon trading that seeks to order the sequence of the transition according to the most profitable uses of carbon pollution. And it's important to note too, though climate finance worldwide did break the $1 trillion mark in 2022, it still remained a fraction of fossil fuel subsidies that still amounted to $7 trillion. Now, our final slide is the current state of the climate crisis. So we've gone through the different ways of conceptualizing this crisis, its history through the Capitolocene, and then some of the market-based responses to it. So then, what's the state of the climate after around 30 years of trying to address it? And I mean, in summary, it's not really good. The annual global carbon budget projects is an important project that has shown or mapped out that fossil carbon dioxide emissions were at about 37 billion tons in 2023, which is up 1% from 2022. There are some falling CO2 emissions in some regions, but they're still rising overall. And that scientists are saying the cutting of fossil fuels is not happening fast enough. Emissions from land use change, like deforestation, are projected to decrease slightly, but it's still too high to be offset by current levels of reforestation. And so the question is, how long until we cross the 1.5 degrees of global warming? And at the current emissions level, the global carbon budget team estimates that a 50% chance of global warming will exceed 1.5 degrees consistently in about 7 years, because emissions from coal, oil, and gas are all projected to continue to increase, whereas technology that look to sequester carbon dioxide or remove it from the atmosphere are really minuscule in comparison. And a new report from the World Meteorological Organization has showed that many records have been broken last year and into early this year for greenhouse gas levels, surface temperature, ocean heat and acidification, sea level rises, Antarctic sea ice cover, and glacial retreat. 2023 was the warmest year on record, with the global average near surface temperature at 1.45 Celsius above the pre-industrial baseline. It was the warmest 10th year period on record as well. On an average day in 2023, nearly 1/3 of the global ocean was gripped by a maritime heat wave, which harmed vital food systems and ecosystems. And towards the end of last year, over 90% of the ocean had experienced heat wave conditions at some point. Antarctic sea ice extent was also the lowest on record, with a huge amount lost over the year. And then the number of people who are acutely food insecure worldwide has more than doubled to 350 million people by 2023. And the World Food Programme has stated that weather and climatic extremes have been important aggravating factors to this increase in starvation. And renewable energy generation, which is primarily driven by the dynamic forces of solar radiation, wind, and the water cycle, have also surged at the forefront of climate action for its potential to achieve decarbonisation targets. Renewable energy capacity has actually increased by almost 50% from 2022 to 2023, which has been the highest rate observed in the past 2 decades. But still, the three main greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, reached record levels in 2022 and into 2023. CO2 levels are 50% higher than the pre-industrial era. And this is despite the increase in renewable energy. And so there has been continued evidence as well for extreme weather and climatic events, which has had huge impacts on nearly every continent. There's been flooding linked to extreme rainfall from the Mediterranean cyclone Daniel affecting Greece, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Libya. In September of last year, tropical cyclone Freddie in February and March was one of the world's longest living tropical cyclones, with major impacts in Madagascar, Mozambique, and Malawi. There was another huge cyclone in May that triggered a 1.7 million displacement across the region from Sri Lanka to Myanmar and through India and to Bangladesh, which also increased the problems of food insecurity. There was a huge hurricane that hit the Mexican coastline late October, of last year, which caused huge economic losses and killed nearly 50 people. And extreme heat is affecting many parts of the world. With places such as Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco comfortably now reaching 50 degrees. The Greater Horn of Africa region, which had been experiencing long-term drought, has now suddenly started experiencing flooding, with flooding displacing 1.8 million people across Ethiopia, Burundi, South Sudan, Tanzania, Uganda, Somalia, and Kenya. Which, in addition to the 3 million people displaced internally or across borders by the 5 consecutive seasons of drought as well. So all of this is to say is that the news isn't looking terribly good. And in response to these developments, climate activists around the world are becoming more militant and more direct in their actions. And such is demonstrated in one of the recommended resources you can find on the Monash Library website, which is the documentary How to Blow Up a Pipeline. And we can also see radicalism in movements such as the Extinction Rebellion. And in response, many countries have instituted draconian laws to limit protests and protect industry. And Australia has been at the forefront of this particular movement. In 2019, for example, in Queensland, laws were enacted to introduce or to make sure protesters who clamped themselves to buildings or other bits of the city would be hit by big fines and longer jail terms. Then in April of 2022, New South Wales government introduced laws and penalties targeting protesters who blocked roads and ports, threatening them up to 2 years in prison and $22,000 worth of fines. And then Victoria followed in August 2022 with harsh new measures which targeted environmental protesters at logging sites with up to 12 months in jail or $21,000 in fines. And in Tasmania, environmental activists now face fines of $13,000 or 2 years in prison, while non-governmental organisations that have been found to support members of the community to protest face fines of over $45,000. And the South Australian government introduced harsh new anti-protest measures with bipartisan support just after 20 minutes of debate and no public consultation, which increased fines up to $50,000 or 3 months in jail. So this kind of continues as well Australia's very long history of clampdowns against disruptive protests, and also, more importantly, Australia's long history of disruptive protests to protect the environment. One of the most classic examples of this was the green bans, which was a form of economically disruptive direct action that saved several historical sites, and most notably the Rocks area in Sydney, which is at the time when this was happening in the 70s, were going to be demolished to make way for office towers. So from the early 70s to the mid 70s, unionised workers with the New South Wales Builders Labourers Federation would halt any work associated with these developments. And this was called a green ban. And ultimately, this form of direct action economically harmed developers and investors, and developments were put to a halt. And so planned development ceased as labourers withdrew their labour and communities mobilised to prevent the developments from taking place. And this protected several important environmental sites which are still held dear today. So overall, as the climate crisis continues to worsen, more and more people seem to be instituting direct action and militant activities as the liberal structures which have been instituted to handle the crisis are being shown to be more and more inadequate. And so this kind of speaks to the points that we've made around how capital and also the liberal way of understanding the world has developed since the 1500s, and even today in terms of the financialized response to the climate crisis. And it seems to not really be halting the catastrophe as it moves on, and people around the world seem to be mobilizing even more against it. So that was the week 11 lecture team. We only have one more week left to go. And I'm very excited to see you all in our tutorials this week. I hope the assignments and the research essays go well, and your tutors are also obviously available to consult as you need. So thank you very much, everyone. I look forward to seeing you soon.